Thanks for joining me for our first recorded chat for Lingua Barbara on religion, ethics, and society. So why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Damian Cleary. I am an editor for Lingua Barbara. My column is called The Reluctant Realist, and I am a practicing Roman Catholic, I'm here to talk about religion.
I'm Matt Ray. I'm another editor at Lingua Barbara, and I am not Roman Catholic. I'm not much of anything. I'm not a terribly religious person, but I have gone with Damian to 2 or 3 Latin Masses at this point. Went to a Ukrainian one recently with a mutual friend of ours. So I'm interested in religion, and that's why we're here to talk about it today.
Yeah. So we're going to go over a few topics that'll hopefully spark some interesting conversation, and then hopefully this will become part of an ongoing series.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
We should.
So I guess my big question, or what kind of started this, was I was very curious about Matt going to church at all. And I was curious what he thought. And I remember thinking one night, I was like, what does Matt think I get out of this? You know, why do I waste my time doing these somewhat arcane and strange rituals? I mean, I will admit that they are somewhat strange. So I thought, well, I think it'd be an interesting talk, would be to see what Matt has to say about it, maybe have a discussion. So.
Yeah, and on my part of it was just straight curiosity. So for much of Europe's history, Western people would have every week shared this experience. Yeah. Everywhere from, Ireland in the West all the way out to the Eastern churches where it's different but substantially similar for more than 1,000 years. And this was not something that I'd really been exposed to. I grew up Methodist in the South, and it was very jeans and t-shirt, meet in an old high school kind of thing. About as far away as you could get from this experience. And so my first thing was the same question you're asking. Why do people do this? What do they get out of going there?
Well, and I think we should touch on it too. And I alluded to this earlier, is that, so maybe you can talk on it more, is just how kind of foreign some of the things were. The practice of ritual was kind of foreign to you, I think. And
because we're at a Catholic Jesuit school, I have people available who not only go to the place but have done research on their religion, deep thought. So this was kind of a take it or lose it opportunity to learn about something I wasn't at all familiar with, really. And so the very first time I went, I eased in through English. Our mutual friend took me to a church downtown with organ and boys choir and everything, and I was lost, I was completely blown away. Because everything is scripted, everything has symbolic importance, but also just a place. And it's interesting seeing everyone around me knows what we're doing. Everyone around me, this performance speaks to them in a way that it doesn't speak to me. And so that was very anthropological. Okay, so here's part one of the answer. Everybody here is able to communicate on the basis of this common experience. And they're able to get meaning out of this just by seeing the priest's motions, just by seeing the iconography. Mm-hmm. It all speaks to them in a way that it doesn't speak to me.
Right.
And there's a little bit of the, if you imagine what it was like to be a kid walking down the street, and you see all the signs, but you can't read them. That's very much where I am.
I also wanted to mention, we should probably mention, I don't think the point of this discussion is to really debate some of the bigger questions about religion, like the existence of God, or like the problem of evil. I mean, it might come up, and I'm not opposed to talking about it, but I think we're more trying to just examine what religion is and what it does, rather than trying to figure out if its first principles are correct.
Yeah, that's certainly right. My focus coming in here is more sociological and maybe more phenomenological. Meaning, so the kind of shared ritual, that's a very sociological point. A community built on a shared reference point, a set of shared reference points, and forced to see its members face to face regularly. I think will develop differently than a community like an internet forum where you never see their faces and you may or may not have shared rituals. And that's still a stronger community than like all the people who work in the library. Does the person experience, what do they go through being present or taking part in this ritual? How is that changing their experience then of the other 6 days of the week, right?
That's a fair point. I always compare it to a play almost, especially some of the higher liturgies. And when I say liturgy, I mean Roman Catholic and somewhat Eastern Orthodox liturgy. I can't speak to a lot of other liturgies. But I see it as a kind of a play and a kind of a reenactment in which I take part in. And there is a sense of loss of individuality to a degree in the kind of the motions and the actions and a lot of the iconography, and it's a very ordered experience. And I find, and maybe this is partially who I am, I find that very soothing and very, very comforting. And it's also nice to be with, and there's also a communal aspect to it, and I enjoy the community of spending time. So I think even at a very kind of base level, I think even more basic than that, I think human beings like ritual. They like repeated events. They like regularity at the very least. And liturgy is often like that on steroids to some degree. It's hyper regularity, especially in some of the higher rites. But at the very basic level, that's what I find is soothing. And I think something like that is necessary for people. I don't know. I don't know. I've never been without it. So
no, and even the little rituals of life, like this is. I've been working in this position for 2 weeks, and I don't think we've missed a Tuesday or a Thursday yet without getting tea.
Exactly.
Just immediately given an opportunity to fall into a pattern, people will take it. When I was teaching class, like I never assigned seats. But I've never had a class that didn't assign itself seats.
Oh yeah, they do it all
always go back to the same chair, and that's tiny, but it shows just how pervasive that mindset is.
Yeah.
Whereas in some respect, religious traditions and cultural orders, like stronger cultural orders, are just more frank about like, yes, we have these ritualized behaviors. Maybe they're not. There's no first principles demonstration of why we have to do it this way on this day, but we do, and it's important that we keep doing it.
Yeah, I think there's a pretty common misconception, even among religious people. I think religious people are maybe even more guilty of this than non-religious people. Is that there's a kind of essential way that this has to be the way it is. I mean, it is and it isn't, right? There is a lot of the ritual is for us. I think that's what people often forget is that it's a we do ritual. It's our way of doing things, but I don't think God requires ritual per se.
Right.
I just think we require ritual. That people tend to, I run into this problem. If you don't, even more basic, if you don't habituate something, if you don't, like a good habit, like if you don't habituate working out, or if you don't, or even a bad habit, if you habituate smoking, you will do it. You will keep doing it.
Yeah.
And if you don't habituate it, you won't do it.
Which is not really that desirable, honestly. And while you were speaking, I was thinking, there's maybe two attitudes at least toward ritual, and probably a lot more, but a kind of sympathetic magic one, where like the universe requires us to do this, or God requires us to do this.
Yeah.
And that idea is that it's directly efficacious, right? If we sacrifice this man, the sun will rise tomorrow.
Right. Yeah.
And I don't think either of us are really interested in that kind of thinking.
So it's always layered, isn't it? It's I agree. It's not like that, but it's almost like it becomes like that.
Yeah, and that's
was only your second.
Yeah, my second category was just going to be this more like Aristotelian habituation is the road to character. So it is efficacious.
Yeah.
The ritual does matter, but it doesn't matter because turning around 3 times makes the corn grow. It's because learning discipline is what makes you a better person or something like that.
But I think it's more than just turning around makes the corn grow.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to say it's as disjointed as turning around 3 times makes the corn grow.
Mm-hmm.
But it's arbitrary at its start, but then it almost loses its arbitrariness as it becomes a ritual.
Yeah.
So turning around 3 times, making the corn grow, will always be an arbitrary act that has nothing to do. But in the role of religion, it's almost like these originally arbitrary motions.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, a good example might be the sign of the cross, right? Which is an arbitrary motion, for better or for worse, or at least maybe at its beginning was, but kind of takes on. It's not arbitrary anymore.
Right.
It's an essential facet of the faith, so it becomes non-arbitrary.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have, of course, the religious people would then tend to say there is some kind of efficaciousness to the action, which might get close to what you were talking about with sympathetic magic. But it's hard to describe exactly.
Well, some of that might be the arbitrariness of signs, right?
Yeah.
Why the cross and not the fish? Because they were both contenders at the very beginning as symbols, and you just don't see as many.
Yeah, you don't see a lot of fish. Yeah, I more meant the physical motion.
Right. Yeah.
Cross, yeah.
But
that's true. I guess. Yeah.
It could have been a sign of the fish. Right?
That's true. That's true. Yeah. And maybe yeah.
But then whatever is established as communicating, right? It becomes significant. It's a signifier. It stands for things.
Right.
But the power of signifiers is that not only am I communicating to you, I'm carving out the way I think, right? Using the signs, using the symbols, activates all of that. It brings me back to that kind of place.
Maybe you're using the sign as a kind of a conduit for whatever kind of power you're trying to channel, be it a social power at the very basic, be it a spiritual power at the higher level,
right?
Or at the higher level, but the more supernatural level, the spiritual level, whatever.
Yeah. The point of making the sign of the cross before sitting in the altar, I think, to prepare the parishioner's mindset, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Get your head right. Your things are changing, and that kind of ritual power shows up all the time. Like in, why do we light candles and turn down the lights before a romantic dinner? Right? It's just a signal. We've crossed a threshold. We've changed. This is no longer our kitchen. This is now a space in which dating is happening. All these little things to signal. Like people will just pull their tie down, right? I'm off work. I mean, it's officially over.
I'm off work. Yeah.
But then that scales all the way up to is this literally calling God's attention down on this place?
Right. And that's whether you believe it or not.
Right. And that's a different, into much more contestable waters. I find it interesting. So we've used the word liturgy just meaning, what I think of is especially the liturgical calendar, where there's seasons where one is supposed to adopt a particular mindset. The clothes change, the readings change, but they change in an ordered and repeated way. So philosophy says, or just good sense says, don't be a shitbag, right? Don't be a terrible person. Try to take account of what you're doing. Find out if your opinion of yourself is accurate. But then you say, okay, philosophy, when? How? And it's I don't know, all the time, sometime. Whereas, Muslims can say Ramadan. There's your period of fasting. This is the way we do it. And practice this and you'll get better. And Christians would say Lent. This is the way we do it. And I think that's actually super valuable because otherwise every day is exactly the same. To quote Radiohead, I guess.
Good.
Yeah.
I'm glad we're quoting that.
Right.
It wouldn't be a podcast without.
So what do you think about that?
So it reminded me of an argument I had with. It was a debate I had with a friend of mine, and we were talking about what we were giving up for Lent. And one of the things, and he was like, "I just don't see the point of giving something up for Lent. Why Lent? Why this period between Ash Wednesday and Easter Sunday? Makes no sense." And it's true. You have to carve out some kind of time to do this. And it's nice when you're doing the time with other people, when you're kind of sharing in it and you're kind of gathering together and you're all kind of commiserating in your fasting or in your whatever you're giving up. Or people don't always give up anymore. They like to do positive things now. That's the new hotness, as it were.
But it has a similar point. I mean, it's a moral self-work, I guess.
I think when you run into someone who doesn't want to do it, you end up kind of asking, okay, well, when are you going to do it then?
Yeah, exactly.
And, invariably they might say, this is actually an interesting, something I've run into, which I've always questioned about people who are spiritual but not religious, because I've always wondered what their prayer life is like. See, I kind of have to have on Sunday, I have to go to church. And I've always wondered what their prayer life is like. Do they find themselves having to establish their own kind of rules or their own kind of habits in order to do it, or can they just do it on their own without kind of having a regular set schedule to it?
Saying I'm not spiritual but I'm religious makes more sense to me than saying I'm spiritual but not religious. Like having ordered practices makes a ton of sense to me regardless of one's spirituality. But to say, like, I'm spiritual, but I don't want to put it into any shape, that strikes me as a little weirder, because I wonder if you don't just end up inventing a new shape, or what I would worry about is just not doing it. Right?
Yeah.
Because that's the classic, I'm going to get in shape this year. It's like, great. Are you going to walk? Are you going to jog? Are you going to chase squirrels in the park? Like, they're all fine. Just pick one.
Right.
Like, well, I'm going to get in shape. It's like, oh, okay, so you're not. That's what you're telling me. You're not going to get in shape.
Yeah, I've made that deal before.
Yeah, I think we all have. Yeah.
Well, yeah. So that is an important part of liturgical time. There is something nice to it as well, to having holidays. But I think a big part of liturgical time, especially as it developed, and this is going to be something I write up around Christmas time, is the kind of claiming of time, demarcating time the way it wants to demarcate time. That's why you see people who, I think it's one of the reasons why people get so angry about the Christmas holidays debate. I think it's one of the reasons, and even another reason why we kind of stopped doing AD and started doing CE was this tension about who gets to decide how time is divvied up, and who gets to decide how we define a temporal event.
And to be clear, you're referring to Anno Domini and contemporary era.
Is it? Right? I thought it was Common Era.
Or Common Era. Yeah, I'm sorry. You're right.
It's common.
Yeah, that's right. The plebeian era.
Yeah, the plebeian era, and then there was the Common Era. Then there was before the Common Era.
But I see why both perspectives are important, right? Like, somebody wants to say, I don't care about Christmas, or it's not religiously important to me. Why can't I just say Happy Holidays? But also someone saying, wait, no, what's important to me is that it's this specific event. It's not just time off from work. So I'd like your opinion on this, but to just kind of present it real quick. So like with Christmas, we talk about the holiday spirit, getting in the Christmas spirit. It's very clear to me what we're talking about is saying, I'm going to approach the world in a particular mindset. Every people and things have many different ways they can be significant. I'm choosing which one I'm going to make myself be disposed toward the world. I'm going to be more charitable. I'm going to be more family-oriented. I'm going to be more emotional. It's a very maudlin period, right, where people are sadder than usual and happier than usual. And that one seems to be like culture-wide. Like almost everybody gets into that. What do you think, though, maybe on the smaller scale of either other holidays or just weekly Mass? Like, I think Mass is saying, get yourself disposed toward the world in a particular way so that you'll have a kind of experience you wouldn't normally have. So you'll have a kind of thought you wouldn't normally have. What do you make of that?
So I think that it's a mistake to think about it as a once-a-week thing. And that's something that I have struggled with a little bit, or at least not struggled with, but trying to hold myself to, is this idea that it shouldn't just be and once a week I go and do this kind of weird thing. It should be more of a culturally encompassing event. So it should include things that aren't necessarily found in the Mass, that should that are part, and that's where you see a lot of folk religious practices that kind of spring up.
The blessing for the pets.
There was my mom always used to take us to the St. Blaise blessing. So St. Blaise is the patron saint of throat ailments. And so you would go, and the priest would have 2 candles, and he would put them like this, and you would say the blessing of St. Blaise. And so it's little things like that end up kind of it kind of imbues the culture. And that's why you see, even with the Christmas example, why you see this kind of festivity that kind of, because if it was always just meant to be a Sunday event, then it would never have bled into kind of the popular understanding or the popular, people would just put signs up everywhere, or wouldn't put it like, Christmas trees, if it was meant to be kind of kept in its kind of religious sphere. But of course that as you continue to explore into a cultural, you kind of start to align with a culture, you find yourself more and more kind of alien to the rest of the culture. Mm-hmm. And that's not necessarily a complaint that I have. It's just a noticing that, you suddenly start to, and I think a lot of Catholics notice this during Lent, when they have to walk around on Ash Wednesday with ashes on their head, and on Fridays they can't eat meat. Mm-hmm. And I think that ends up being a kind of a weird moment where you have to almost make a choice as to, okay, am I going to be, I can't eat meat today. Right. And now everyone's going to know that this is where my cultural allegiance kind of falls, or maybe it doesn't fall, so you're not going to do it. But.
Yeah. And that carries us into like an unexpected assimilationist or separatist or hybridizing mindset. And of course the risk that it might be read in a more politicized way than one intends.
Yeah, definitely.
So, otherwise simple markers start to get like, oh wait, are people thinking that I'm making a hostile gesture to them by marking myself off as distinct like this?
Yeah.
Are they going to make hostile gestures toward me because I'm marked out? Then I guess you get into a fusion of political, cultural, and religious.
Well, I think it's just an identities. I think it's just identities more than anything else. Like, how do you identify? And that's, that's kind of where it ends up. You end up making these choices on how you identify, and when people don't identify the way you identify, it creates some tension, whether or not it's acceptable tension, or it's not even just one identity. You end up having these like layers of identity that maybe it's what happens is your identity, if you get rid of that kind of unified political identity, you start to fall back on these cultural identities. Mm-hmm. Maybe that's what ends up happening in these situations.
But we wandered a little bit off topic. I want to pull back to, you mentioned Ash Wednesday, the crosses on Ash Wednesday, and eating fish on Friday. So those are, they're very clear kind of external markers that this is somebody who's living a little bit differently. Yeah. How does that go out into the rest of your life? Like, how do you feel like it makes that change for you? Like, not eating meat on Friday?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely kind of makes you think, especially, I mean, it's a little different. It was a little different at BC because it was a little more common. But as I've kind of entered into the working world, it's a little... it's a reminder. It's something you have to keep. But like any reminder, it might be a reminder of annoyance, too. So you might be like, and then it doesn't really do any good if you're constantly complaining because you have to do this thing. Mm-hmm. It may not be efficacious or efficacious in the right direction. But, yeah, there's definitely, any kind of little thing where you have to take into account something common that you do and change it is, it's going to have an effect on you. It's going to cause you to view separately from other people, right? So that when you see people, people who aren't Catholic or aren't Christian eating meat, you see yourself as in some way different from them. Mm-hmm. And that's that. It depends, because that can be very dangerous too, right? And that's the thing about some of these religious stuff is that sometimes it can, if taken the wrong way or if pushed in the wrong direction, it can have a tendency to become dangerous,
right? Yeah.
So, I want to ask you a question. Mm-hmm. What you think religion is?
That's a good question. And I've been thinking about that today in prep for this. Good definition I'm going to paraphrase from a medieval Muslim philosopher. Religion is beliefs and practices set down by a founder to achieve a good end for and by means of a population. So that's a really, really kind of political definition of religion. Yeah. And I do tend toward that view that, the purpose, that religions exist as practices in the sense that McIntyre means it, like these large-scale traditions of shared life, shared thought, shared texts that allow people to communicate fruitfully with one another. And like that can become dogmatism, in which case it's stifling, or it could just become coherence, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like the pieces actually do fit together. We actually are talking about the same thing. We have the same dispositions, and that's super useful. So that tends to be my view of what religious practice itself is like. And then, of course, people want to add on, it's the road to the release from suffering.
Yeah,
Buddhist,
sure,
whatever. There's more complicated bits on top of it.
Well, I guess that leads into what the other question is: what do you think the difference is between a religious system and a political system, or a governmental system? And people often, I often think about the relationship between religion and the state, and so I'm curious what you think, if there's any difference between a state, especially one that has a strong cultural backing, like the United States, and a religion.
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think ethnic nationalism messed with this answer a little bit in the 19th century, but because the ethno-nationalists wanted to say that the state was the expression of a cultural order, and in some places it is, and at that level there isn't much difference left, because the state's taking over or embodying many of those roles, and to some degree every state has this religious component, I think, where we think this is a sanctified order with, we put founding fathers in capital letters, for God's sake. It's very oracular. Right? Yeah. These wise men preached the law to us, and this is what we must adhere to. Well, okay, that's that's an echo.
Yeah, it's pretty religious, and that's the thing about especially in the United States. I don't know if it's how prevalent it is in other places, but there is a kind of religious. Reminds me of BioShock.
This veneration of pushing the founders back in time and elevating them. I think I'm quoting the metaphysics, but so we want to cast the sacred guise around the state, around civil society. Make everybody who's been historically important or is currently important, make that somehow deeper, meaningful. But I do think that they're very different, because I think that the state is tasked with managerial questions that are pervasive and large scale, but not necessarily ethical in the same way that religious questions are, and the same is true in reverse. So, like, the state has an obligation to see to the security of all of its citizens. It has legitimate business regulating the manufacturing of razor blades, these little details. And maybe even taking on education, responsibilities, perhaps taking on healthcare responsibilities in the name of opportunity and safety and dignity. But then you say, well, like, what does it mean to live a good life? What does it mean to participate in meaningful institutions or to be committed to the community? And I don't think that those are appropriately answered through state organization, because they are more about the rituals of life or the process of inquiry, and that's better done through private organized communities. And I think that stuff benefits from not being tangled up in managerial problems. I think they really both lose when, as a Christian, I think the water board taxes should be at 8%.
Yeah.
What are you talking about?
We're very passionate about that topic, as you know.
Right.
I thought we agreed that you would not bring up that tax.
I did. I'm going back on my word. I got caught up in the moment. But, that happens, and I think it just makes everything... there are naturally going to be places where they have to mix together. But busting them apart, it usually just seems to work better. Like, in Iran, the Yazidis, a minority religious group, have trouble getting access to higher education. There's a really good campaign about it. Go Google it. And that makes no sense from a governmental perspective, but it makes sense from a religious zealotry perspective. Sure, and it's like, okay, well, if introducing them makes each of them break in their fundamental domains, do poorly in their fundamental domains, then that's a good enough reason I think, to partition them. What do you think about that?
Well, so that's what I think my teaser was going to be for next week.
Okay.
Or next time we do this, is that I agree with what you're saying, but I think that both have a tendency to be very jealous of each other.
Ooh.
And so that both have a tendency, because I think in the end they both have the same goals.
Mm-hmm.
I think, and yeah, government ends up being focused on a certain area, religion ends up being focused on a certain area, and I don't disagree with that, and I think it's probably a good thing, but I think in the end, when you have society, or when you have a religious system and you have a political system, that they end up trying to subsume each other.
Mm.
Because I think that religion gets jealous of the state, and the state gets jealous of the religious authority, and so you end up with this problem. But I think that we should discuss that next time.
That's more than enough.